On today's show, we are delving into the game of Roger McQueen, one of the highest upside players in the 2025 NHL draft, who's been marred with injuries this season.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm your host, Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects, and today we'll be delving into the game of a player that we have ranked in our top 5 and have done so all season long, Roger McQueen, a dynamic 6'5" power forward who's missed a long portion of the season with a back injury. And we'll be delving into the injury itself a little bit in today's episode as well, breaking down what it was and what future elements there are to consider with this specific injury and what's perhaps been a little bit overblown. Then we'll also be delving into the overall puck skills here in the first segment, which are really special elements in Roger McQueen's game. The handling, the passing, the shooting are all well above NHL average in projection. And we'll also talk about that physicality and skating and how that plays in to his game. Then in the second segment, we'll be looking at the overall intelligence, the IQ, the habits, and the overall toolkit, how the puck skills combine together, how they work in combination in the second segment. And finally, in the third, we're going to wrap things up by looking ahead, looking forward at where he might get drafted, which NHL teams are good fits, what his potential ceiling and floor are at the National Hockey League level, and which players have similar playing styles to this player. All that coming up here on today's episode. But before we dive into everything, today's show is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So let's get things started here with Roger McQueen, a really big customer. He is a 6'5", 192-pound right shot forward. He's played on the wing and at center this season, but mostly down the middle as a center both before and after his injury. And we at Elite Prospects maintain that he is a center projection in all likelihood. Again, a lot depends on what the NHL team that drafts him decides to do with his development. I think he could be developed into a really high-end winger as well, but we're going to be sticking with the overall center projection here for the purposes of today's episode. And I'm going to pop here on screen, if you're watching on YouTube, a little bit of a breakdown of Roger McQueen's scoring this season. He's played in 17 games and he's scored 10 goals, 10 assists for 20 points in the regular season. And then in 3 playoff games in a very disappointing series against the Lethbridge Hurricanes, he scored 1 goal in 3 games. In those 17 regular season games, McQueen was a +8 and had 40 penalty minutes, which is something to keep an eye on. But last year in 53 games, he logged 50 penalty minutes, and the year before it was half that. So he's already in his 3rd full WHL season. He's already logged over 100 games played in the WHL before this season even began. So he has a larger sample to look at here in terms of what he's done beyond just this campaign. And I've gone back to watch some of his D-1 tape as well when he was out during the season, and even then it was so apparent how skilled he is. He's an October 2nd, 06 birthday, so very, very old for this draft class. He's just about 2 weeks off from being eligible for the 2024 draft, so that's something to keep in mind here as well with his developmental runway. But missing his entire draft year campaign, I really think that there's going to be some room to make up lost ground as well next season and the year after that. And when he did come back from injury this season, because he only played, I believe, in like 9 games like in the fall before getting injured. It may have been less, it may have been 7 or so. But ever since he came back, he played more than 10 games. And in those, I thought he looked fantastic. There was one particular game against the Moose Jaw Warriors that I caught in a 5-4 victory for the Brandon Wheat Kings, where he scored a goal, 2 assists for 3 points, has some really dynamic plays off the rush, and really showing what made him not just a top 5 contender for us early this season, but a top 3 real option. And at this point in the draft, with the big injury and the smaller sample that we've had to look at in terms of just this year's viewings, it's understandable that he's dropping down a couple rungs, but I don't think this is the player to overcorrect on. I think that he still has a fantastic amount of upside. And even though there are some concerns around injuries, and we'll talk about player comps a little bit in the last segment today, but in terms of looking at a guy from last season, Caden Lindstrom, who had some similar elements, like similarly dangerous shot, good in motion for his size off the rush, really layered game with the playmaking growing as the year progressed, the handling being a strength. There are some parallels between those players, but Lindstrom's injuries were a lot more significant, I think, in terms of the stress point looking ahead as well, of what that means for the player longer term than it has been with Roger McQueen. So there's a chance that there's a bit of an NHL draft overcorrection, that he falls further than he should. But I think a team's going to get very, very lucky if that ends up happening and he ends up slipping to like 9th, 10th, or 11th overall. And let's talk about that injury. So he missed 5 or 6 months of the season to a back injury. And it was a back injury known as spondylolysis, which is a pars fracture of the spine. And while it is quite a dangerous injury, and I mean, obviously nobody wants to have a fracture in their spine of all places, it's not an uncommon injury either in sports, let alone just in hockey. In other sports like football, especially with offensive linemen, it's an injury where if the spine like overextends is basically the issue, and where it can happen, a forced spinal extension. And that happens in these types of contact sports, but it's not been an injury that in various different sports in recent seasons has been a massive, like career ending, massive affecting injury that even required surgery in many cases. And while it is significant and takes a lot of time to rehab, and I'm not trying to downplay the pain and the difficulties of this injury in any way, because I'm sure it is entirely unpleasant, it's not the kind of injury that scares us in terms of repeated injuries down the line, of it being re-aggravated significantly. So that's something to note here with this player and with the injury kind of looming over his season this year. But to kind of break down the puck skills here, because there's a lot to dig into to wrap up this first segment. The shot is fantastic. Roger McQueen has a really powerful, whippy release. Doesn't need all that much space to get it off either. You can do it like in awkward angles with an extended stick. Doesn't have to be right in his wheelhouse to get off something dangerous. And that adaptability, and that's powered by a lot of intelligence, as we'll delve into in the next segment, is something that really it elevates it and makes it a much easier projection to the NHL level than perhaps like better mechanical shots that other players in this draft class might have, but that aren't underlying with all of these fantastic habits and some really, really projectable elements for the next level. In terms of the passing ability, it might be even better. I've seen some fantastic flashes from Roger McQueen this season. Off the rush, quick little give and goes, a quick hook pass to go around an extended stick from a defender. He's constantly changing the angles of his release of his passes. Very deceptive look-offs, no-look little passes, little fakes one way in order to go the other, and opening up that lane to get a defender to commit in one direction and then attacking east, for instance. But he's just a really, really layered and dynamic passer of the puck, and that's all powered by handling that might be the best of any of this trifecta of puck skills. The handling skill is just so skilled. I mean, it might be boiling it down a little bit too much there, but he's just so fluid with the puck on his stick. Very, very unlocked top hand. He's just constantly moving the puck around, and he's able to like contour his upper body to adapt and to squeeze through little lanes, and can show one thing and then so quickly explode and do something else. And he uses his frame so well to protect possession. He layers physicality into his puck rushes, and that combination of physicality and handling skill is just unstoppable at this level when it's on its game. So the handling, the passing, the shooting, these are all fantastic tools and big elements of why he's a player that I see as a top 5 potential pick here this season. And if he does drop a little bit further, and we'll talk about that in the last segment when we talk about team fits, because I think there's a very good chance he slips a little bit because of the injury and the question marks, and not being perhaps as refined or crystallized as a player as guys like Caleb Desnoyers or Anton Frondel are. So much skill, so much upside with this player. The skating, I also think, is a strength. He's a big man, clearly still gaining comfort at that size. But there's real fluidity with his movements. We saw that a bit more earlier on the season. There's a bit more rigidity and rust, obviously, later on in the campaign after his lengthy injury. But overall, he's a pretty adept mover. I think that he can improve in terms of agility and lateral explosiveness, but overall, in terms of straight line speed, he can really win his races. And I think he's just a good mover as a whole. Like, he's an above average skater in a vacuum, let alone at 6'5". That's something to keep a note of as well. But last but not least, we have the physicality. And this is obviously a big part of his game. He's a huge player, and the physicality is still an element that's growing and blossoming in his game. We saw this much more actually in the back half of the season after he came back from injury than early in the campaign. Was his physical involvement, a lot more grit, a lot more just desire to get involved inside, get down the middle, go through sticks, go through hands. Doesn't matter if it's a comfortable route, he just powered his way through sometimes. And we saw that physicality also be there on the defensive side in terms of just very physical forechecking and using that combination of reach and strength and size to constrict space from opponents, finish his checks, create force turnovers, and overall just like lay on some pain for the opposition. And especially come playoff time, you need your big players to do that. And in the NHL, the ones who don't, it's literally something that looms over their heads like an umbrella for their entire careers if they're not able to do that. And McQueen is already growing into that game here as a draft eligible player who missed so much of the season. So overall, I think that this is a player with significant upside and a guy whose tools are among the best in the entire draft class. But really what elevates him to the next level is the intelligence that underpins all of this skill. And we'll dive into that a bit more in the next segment. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is not just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. Now I budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track your spending, and even plan your long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. All right, let's keep this episode rolling in the second segment, breaking down the habits, the tools, and the toolkit here, and the intelligence for Roger McQueen. There's a lot to dig into. So, kicking things off with Roger McQueen's hockey sense, an overall encapsulation of how smart and effective he is on the ice. This isn't just in terms of refined details and being meticulous in the game. It's about the intelligence also in terms of manipulative skills and being able to kind of control what happens on the ice around you through awareness and timing and just overall deceptive maneuvers. Intelligence is a much more complex thing than just being intelligent enough to follow your assignment and do what's asked of you. It's about really being able to create things out of nothing and use one's intelligence to just create advantages, not just stop skilled players. And Roger McQueen is certainly a player that I think embodies these traits. He's not the most detailed defensive player yet. He works hard, but he overcommits on some back checks, and overall positionally still has to learn exactly where he has to be and work on the agility to adapt on that small area defensive game in order to be a plus level defensive projection in the NHL. But what makes him highly intelligent is his ability to read defensive structures, manipulate, drag players out of position in order to get a teammate going into that space and slipping a well-timed pass right into that as an area pass, whereas other players would perhaps only see what's in front of them and go for a little dump in rather than try to tug at the defensive position and create these new gaps and create advantages for his teammates to go in and drive and exploit. And this is something that I've seen with McQueen all year long. Like, obviously not when he's injured, he's not playing, but beginning of the season and late in the campaign, this is a player who's able to use his intelligence to have big effects on the game, on the ice, and also on his opposition. And that influential ability and that gravitational pull on defenses and being able to use that and exploit that to create offense, that is a mark of elite level offensive players in the NHL. You don't get to an elite level offensive output in the NHL without building this kind of manipulative game, and McQueen has it in spades. So these are the elements that make him such an exciting prospect. Yes, there is an element of risk. Certainly, we haven't seen all that much of him this season. He's pretty old for the draft class, and overall a guy who, how much of his production and dynamism is just him understanding the WHL game at a really high extent? There are some of these questions that are valid and that we've had discussions about all year long, but the pros just so far outweigh the cons. There's so much upside and skill. And overall, I think that this is a player that could change the outlook of an NHL franchise if he hits. And that kind of prospect, if available past fourth or fifth overall, in my book, you just go running to the stage to pick, because these are the players that you will regret forever if you pass on. And if you swing and miss on this player, at least you miss on the swinging for the right kind of profile, for a player that could change the outlook of your franchise if he panned out, rather than just a bit of a bunt of a pick of trying to get a player to fill a spot in your middle six. Roger McQueen is a swing for the fences, and the intelligence is a really big part of that. It also elevates the other aspects of his game. As I was mentioning, it creates playmaking opportunities, but it also creates a lot of goal scoring for this player. He's able to find soft ice in the offensive zone, stick in blind spots. Even though he's a big guy, he can get lost down low in the offensive zone. And I think that these elements and this diversity in terms of offensive skill, offensive output, offensive instincts is what makes him also so projectable to the NHL game. He's not reliant on one single aspect of his toolkit, of his habits, of his intelligence to create his advantages, something that can just be stifled by clever NHL defenders. He is adaptable, and that adaptability, being able to improvise in a pinch, but also being able to lead with planned attacks and real ideas in his offensive incursions, that makes him a high-end prospect in my book. The rush offense is a really big part of this, and it's where I think a lot of this comes together. Roger McQueen shows just how adaptable he is when he's in motion, catching an awkward pass that's behind him and slipping it back through his legs off of his skate, and then it's right in front of him, and he's charging right back down the flank or cut into the middle of the ice. He has his head up. He's constantly trying to layer in some shoulder fakes, trying to show one thing before going the other way. And these things are just so dynamic. And when he flashes his skill at its highest levels, he is truly potentially the most shift dominating player in the entire draft class this year when everything comes together. And that potential is just so exciting, especially if you're a team picking in that, I don't know, 5 to 10 range. I think if you can get a player like this in that range of the draft, you are absolutely making out like bandits. So Roger McQueen, one of my favorite players in this year's draft, even though there are still some question marks, but we're going to look ahead at where he might go on draft day, which teams are the best fits, and what his overall ceiling and floor are in the next segment. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. All right, let's wrap up the show here in the final segment, talking about Roger McQueen of the Brandon Wheat Kings. Just such a fun power forward. And because of all the strengths that we were highlighting in the previous two segments, this is a guy that I think has to go top 10 at the draft. I did post a mock draft a couple weeks ago where I had him slipping all the way past the top 17, but I think that that is just one possibility of how the draft falls. And this year is incredibly erratic in terms of predictability compared to the average draft year. Once you pass, like, I don't know, third, fourth overall, it is absolutely up in the air of how things are going to fall, and you're going to see surprise picks, some surprise like reaches in the eyes of the public, and other guys that fall for apparently no reason. This happens every year. I think it's going to be even more insane than usual this campaign, but if I'm a betting man, I'm not betting on Roger McQueen falling outside the top 11 or 12. I think that the skill is just going to be too much to pass up for teams, especially if you're a team like the New York Rangers. If you hang on to that 12th overall pick, why would you pass up a player like Roger McQueen, who brings just so much upside and potential down the stretch? He plays a big physical game. Same thing with the Pittsburgh Penguins, who need any kind of skill in their prospect pool. I don't think that he's going to realistically fall beyond those teams if we're taking the odds, but you never know what can happen. It's the NHL draft. You probably have a better chance at lottery tickets than predicting draft orders nowadays. So a lot can happen here. It's going to be interesting to see, but I still think that 4 to 10 range is probably most likely in terms of where he's going to be available. We'll see if a team like the Nashville Predators take a big swing on a guy like Roger McQueen. I think he could be up their alley there at 5th overall. But if James Higgins is available, I think that there are limited arguments in taking McQueen over him at this stage, even though McQueen does bring so much physicality that Higgins clearly lacks. That said, you then have a couple more teams there at 6 and 7 that I think would be really nice fits for Roger McQueen, and that's the Boston Bruins at 7th overall and the Philadelphia Flyers at 6th overall. These are two teams that could really use big centers, need an influx of skill in their pools. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Philadelphia decide to go for a bit more of a solidifying two-way guy rather than like your Roger McQueen swing for the fence on offense type of player. And guys like Frondel and Desnoyers are very conceivably going to be available. At least one of them should be. But the Boston Bruins, I think that he's right up their alley. They showed that they're not afraid of waiting and like on a longer term project with their first round pick last year, Dean Letourneau, who is off to a slow and steady development there at Boston College, but he's always going to be a long-term project. So definitely don't think that he's a finished project at this stage. But McQueen brings way more skill to the equation than Letourneau has ever done. So he'd be a really nice fit there in Boston. But the last two teams I wanted to highlight here in terms of potential fits are the Seattle Kraken, who I think could really use that combination of dynamism and size on offense. They haven't really picked a big dynamic forward ever, really, I think, in their drafting history, at least in terms of like high end, like top 2 round selections. I think I might be wrong, but I'd love to hear from you down below if I am. But still, for a team that's gone out and selected guys like Shane Wright and Matty Beniers, some really solid two-way centers, and then Berkeley Catton last year, who's really dynamic but undersized, to add in a guy like McQueen to double down on dynamic skill, but add in this rampant physicality, that's a fantastic fit in my book. And I think that if they decide to go for a forward, McQueen might be the best fit on profile alone. But last but not least, I do not think he's falling past the Pittsburgh Penguins at 11th overall, a team that just needs skill. They need dynamism. They need talent. They need upside in their pool. There's a limitation of it, significantly so at the moment. And I think McQueen is just an ideal fit. If he is available at 11th overall, I would be shocked if Kyle Dubas and co. Pass on him, because he's just such a fantastic fit for what they need to build around, and they need building blocks. And Roger McQueen could be a really significant chunk of your future, and securing that outside the top 10, that is found money in my eyes. But let's talk a little bit about the overall ceiling and floor for this player. In terms of ceiling, I'm shooting really high with this. Your offensive driving number 1 center with high-end physicality, who's creative and excellent off the rush. There's so much to like with Roger McQueen. Maybe you're going to have to pair a really solid two-way winger on his side, but the defensive desire has always been there with this player. Just the details that really have to take a step, and that always ends up being the case, especially for these high-end picks who have the desire to work on their defense. The details work out with time, and he's not going to be a Selke candidate, I don't think, at any point in his career. But being able to match up against top lines as the number 1 center, I think that's within the realm of possibility in his development. Beyond that, I think that all of his tools really do support that top line projection. If he ends up on a second line, I think it's still entirely plausible, but maybe he also ends up getting moved and shifted over to the wing on a top line to fall in. If a team already has like a franchise caliber center, then sure, maybe move him to the wing. But with the teams that are picking in this range, if it's Seattle, I can understand definitely moving him over to the wing when you have these solid two-way centers in your top 6, like Wright and Beniers. But beyond that, for most other teams mentioned here, they need centers, and he can play center very well. So I think Roger McQueen is a really high value selection on draft day. I'd love to hear from you down below what your thoughts are on this player and which NHL players play the most similar styles to him. I came up with 3 players here that I think have some similarities. One of whom has yet to play a single NHL game, and I already talked about him earlier in the episode, Caden Lindstrom, in terms of some of those similarities of how they play the game, being really big, being really toolsy, being really intelligent, having grown significantly over the course of their draft year campaign of what they're doing on the ice, but also being marred with injuries. Then, in terms of actual current NHLers, the first one that came to mind was Mark Scheifele as a dynamic playmaking center. This is more if that defensive game never does take that extra step here for Roger McQueen. I think that Mark Scheifele in a role where you kind of have to be insulated by a really good like two-way winger on one side, but can just absolutely like do anything in the offensive zone with his high-end shot, high-end handling, high-end playmaking, very creative, very intelligent, very manipulative. These are all elements that Roger McQueen has in abundance as well. And I think that, and also in terms of violence on the ice, with McQueen, you might get a bit more proactive physicality as well than you've seen from Mark Scheifele. But that's kind of, I think, the upper ends of the upside as like a really, really, really good first line center who finishes top 15 in NHL scoring every once in a while. That's within the realm of possibility here for McQueen in my eyes. But beyond that, one more player I wanted to highlight here as a comp is Philip Forsberg. Maybe if he ends up getting switched over to the wing, McQueen ends up falling a bit more along these lines, but he brings just that combination of size and middle drive and power and skill, just so deft, so creative, high-end playmaking, really good shot, being very adaptable in his offensive implications and overall creation in the offensive zone, not being hemmed into one specific thing. I think that there are some similarities there between those two players. But did you come up with a better player comp? I'd love to hear from you down below in the comments. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube as per usual, leave me a comment in general. Let me know what you thought about the episode, what your thoughts are on Roger McQueen, and why your NHL team should draft this player. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please do make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always appreciated. And for your second listen of the day, you can head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel break down everything you need to know to build yourself a sustainable and competitive fantasy roster. But that is all for me today. I'm your host, Sebastian High. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you again very, very soon.